This is Art Zink, and this is a story about my first dog. Also involves my grandpa, and of course myself as the grandson and the dog owner. Her name was Lassie. The story will tell you everything you need to know about her. There's hunting dogs and there's cow dogs, and then there's really worthless mutts. I'd say your dog falls somewhere between the last two, but we'll try. Grandpa had passed judgment, and the only court of appeals was going to be the field. Any farm kid of 11 worth his 4-H badges has got to own stock, and I did not. The calf I had laid claim to a year earlier had disappeared one day while I was at school, the basement freezer running continuously for a day and a half after. A horse was not even a prospect, because, as Dad said, we had 30 of them sitting under the hood of the farmall, and a sheep, I suspected, would only go the way of the vanishing calf. Of chickens we had hundreds, but I'd long since sworn no such fragile and senseless creatures would ever tread a barnyard at my volition. There wasn't much left except pigs and more cats, and I was trying hard to generate enthusiasm for the inevitable when my 12th birthday rolled around. Dad came into the kitchen that morning with an oversized cardboard box, avoiding my mother's tight-lipped stare, sat it on the floor in front of me with a quiet, "Happy birthday, son." Dirty, unwrapped, with the flaps merely laid over, the box obviously did not contain much of value. I was steeling myself for an appropriate display of gratitude as I turned back the flaps, but forgot any proprieties at the sight of fur. Cowering at the bottom was a half-grown pup, liquid brown eyes rolled up at me, tail tucked tightly against her side, muzzle protected between her forelegs. "Pound said she's had a rough life so far," Dad said. "Somebody found her wandering along a railroad track and turned her in. Been mistreated bad. She's your dog now, but don't you be mistreating her, or he'll get the same." So saying, he bit his lip, glanced at Ma, and went back out the kitchen door to the day's work. Dad called her a collie because she had some patches of gold mixed in with the white and brown. She became one of a whole generation of Lassies, because Walt Disney had just produced the movie of that name, and I have no doubts that every one of those dogs was at least as smart, as courageous, and as faithful as a movie star, just like mine. We spent most of the first day huddled together on the lawn and making introductions. My younger sisters petted, hugged, poked, and peered from one side, while I draped my arm protectively across Lassie's shoulders from the other. She endured all of it, responding to nothing. It was after I rushed back out after lunch. The family ate meals together and on time, period. Animals were not allowed in the house, period. That I found her in the same spot, but with head upraised. Her tail gave 2 tentative thumps as I flopped down beside her, and we spent the rest of the day discussing what a fine world it was going to be. Lassie was decidedly timid, deferring to the cats at the feed bowl, shrinking away before a raised voice, hiding at the roll of Midwestern thunder. But she was no coward. When a city relative stepped out of his car with a fine new English pointer right behind, that fact was emphasized in a flash of gold that caught the big dog broadside and rolled him twice before he came up snarling. Much fur and a little blood later, we had separated the two and defined protocol for any visiting dogs. Leash both, make introductions with ourselves between them, and see how the ensuing contact went. It usually went poorly. When it went poorly several times on Sundays just before dinner, Ma seemed quietly pleased at the resultant decline in uninvited traffic. Just a month after her arrival, my little dog's status was elevated to that of heroine in one act, taking on the farmstead bull. That animal was hornless, monstrous in size, and seemingly as docile as the chickens pecking beneath his feet. His bulk was intimidating enough that I usually kept a wary eye on his presence, but this time I was preoccupied with extricating a ball of baling wire that had been trampled into the mud before the tangle could catch and cut a hoof. A snort and rush of air at my back was accompanied by a heavy nudge that threw me forward on my face, and I knew instantly what had happened and what was going to happen. A roar erupted over my head, and when it was not followed by the pain I expected, I lifted my head from the muck and saw behind me a 3/4-ton bull desperately swinging a golden nose ornament. I crawled through the corral poles, Lassie shot through behind me, and I tried to hug her bug-eyed as she tried just as hard to clean me up with a tongue still wet with blood. Ma had seen the whole thing from the kitchen window. It was an article of pride for a farmer to let no debt go unpaid, and Ma had known no other life. Whereas she had initially grouped all dogs as worthless animals, that is, anything that required more in maintenance than it produced an income, she now found perfectly reasonable excuses to do things she had never done before, like shooing the cats from the feed bowl till Lassie had gotten the best scraps. Cats have to be hungry if they're going to catch any mice. Or letting Lassie in the basement at the first grumbles of thunder, better than trying to find her under the neighbor's barn. I noticed how dry rags quickly replaced soiled or wet ones in the doghouse, how balls of combed-out fur blew around the yard as the first days of summer began to simmer, and how extra fats appeared as scraps in bitter weather. Dad must have noticed, too. It would joke to me about the dog fairy being at work again. The first premonitions for her hunting career were not positive when Lassie sought the nearest dark corner at the sounds of an approaching storm. Curiously, though, she never showed signs of gun shyness, and after a crow was shot over her, she danced like any lab when a gun appeared. It was not much of an extension for me to visualize her as a hunting dog. Grandpa was a logical intercessor at this point, the old man having decided during the Depression that the Banks were better farmers than himself. He had turned then almost full-time to hunting and fishing, gotten himself an Irish setter while the breed still had some sense left in the line, and trained the dog himself. Grandma had passed early, and the kids had all left home, and so, dispossessed of a family and farm, Grandpa had turned to odd jobs to support himself, his dog, and his vices. In that corner of southeast Michigan, he was the first choice of anyone needing firewood put up, as long as you had the foresight to need it before hunting season. I remember watching his dog flowing across the stubble field like a ground fire, flashing at the edges and sweeping turns, locking into red coals at the last corner where the field met a brush row. Grandpa walked in without hurry, and the rooster rose from under the dog and swung, one ember blown free of the fire that held him, quartering away toward the woods. The bird tumbled in a shower of golden sparks, but the dog was solid red stone, and Grandpa only dropped the butt of his gun a bit, and holding the muzzle high and out in front of him, took one measured pace ahead. 2 hens boiled out, and Grandpa swung them, said bang and bang again, and turned and grinned at me. The dog had never moved, but only stared intently at the last feathers drifting down on the fallen rooster. "Fetch," Grandpa said softly, and the dog catapulted ahead and trotted back with a rainbow in his mouth. I knew at that moment that someday I would have a dog just like Grandpa's. Though I was sure Lassie was going to be such a dog, Grandpa clearly had reservations. Grandpa had faith in neither his own skill in training nor Lassie's breeding that I did. Come, stay, heel, and hand signals were a piece of cake. She was attentive, eager to please, and wanted no more than an affirmative pat for any amount of effort. Clearly the dog was teachable. Clearly also the dog had a nose good enough for the job. Although the farm had 80 acres of grain fields, woods, and buildings, my sisters had no chance at all at hide and seek until Lassie was barred from competition. Neighbor kids and relatives only had to be talked into playing barefooted, and Lassie would sniff their sock and hunt them down. Grandpa was clearly impressed when she ran a spiraling scent trail to a hidden sausage, even if he seemed a bit apprehensive at her speed in getting there. "You got a dog can hunt with you," he told me then, "so now you got to remember all the rest is fine points. Ain't no two dogs the same, and yours is bound to hunt different than mine. The problem you two got is to figure out what each of you does best and know how you can work together to outsmart the bird, 'cause there ain't no rooster pheasant was ever born dumb." What Lassie did not do best was point or hold or even retrieve. To say she was a flushing dog was a gross understatement. She seemed to accelerate from the moment of hitting a scent trail until the bird was in the air, occasionally getting a tail feather, and not infrequently overrunning a holding bird so that he flushed behind her. My vision of Lassie's delicate collie form, painted in detail on a backdrop of Midwestern autumn color, was doomed to frustration. The leisurely walk up to the staunch point was instead a desperate run to try to get in range before the flush. Grandpa had gotten Lassie to work close as long as there were no bird scent in her nose, but when the olfactories kicked in, she knew only one speed. I had a problem. What your dog does best is run, and what you do best is shoot. There's some room for improvement in your case. Grandpa was breaking the news to me that Lassie was not going to be a pointing dog, but never cutting me any slack on the idea that hunting success was a mutual responsibility. If the two of you can't outsmart the bird deserves the cornfield. Darwin's was a gentle philosophy compared to Grandpa's. Midwestern grain fields in southeastern Michigan trended toward the smallish by comparison to the rolling seas of green tassel one found in the mid and tall grass prairie states. Everyone near the industrial cities of the area was buying a little piece of ground in the atmosphere of optimism and affluence that followed World War II. Small farms were often supported by factory jobs in nearby Detroit or Toledo. The urbanization of agriculture had begun. Woodlots of mixed hardwoods still ate at the edges of plowed ground, and drainage ditches crisscrossed the black clay soils, rushing away snowmelt and spring rain so a farmer could plant. The combination of all this resulted in a checkerboard landscape of woodlots, fields, and farm buildings dropped down wherever space could fit in a tractor. A 40-acre field was a big one, 20 acres more the norm. Some game birds adapted and some struggled. Pheasant populations had built steadily during the war, but afterwards the ground nesters, especially bobwhite quail, began to suffer heavy losses from the indiscriminate use of DDT. That pesticide had saved and was saving the lives of millions of people worldwide from malaria, but the hubris of final solution thinking held us back from considering the consequences of overuse. We had decimated one of those least of God's creatures and troubled the subsequent star. There were rabbits, of course, and Lassie's nose would bring them around if her speed didn't put them to ground first. And squirrels, which she would search the treetops for just as intently as myself, and take hand signals to move them around to my side of the tree for the shot. But the declining pheasants were the jackpot prize. Big, green-headed, ring-necked, cackling roosters that were heart attacks waiting in the grass. The score at the end of the first season was somewhat lopsided in favor of the birds. I had missed one crosser pushed out by another party, and a charging bird that had come down a corn row at me jumped at my feet and roared off behind. Lassie probably came closer to him than my shot string did. The others were all way out there, a tail feather's length ahead of the dog. It wasn't until the next summer that we began to think in terms of being smarter than the birds. I was pulling mustard from calf-high oats that day, the yellow splashes behind me turning brown on a sea of green in the heavy August sun. Lassie had found a gopher hole on a shaded creek bank at the far end of the field and was busy excavating. When I called, she looked up, began trotting toward me, then stopped dead and shot off at an angle. That bird started with a good lead, but Lassie was gaining fast when he finally jumped just 50 yards out and roared over my head toward a neighbor's alfalfa. I got off 3 shots with my hoe before he was out of range. When Lassie panted in happily, I confided to her that our success ratio was about to soar in the coming season. Teaching her to come on a silent signal was a natural extension of her earlier training. I would sit her, walk away, then shout "come" and toss my hat into the air. By the second lesson, she would come at a silently thrown hat. By the third lesson, she would watch me disappear into cover at a distance and come at a run toward wherever my hat reappeared in the air. We were ready. Pheasant season opened at noon October 20th in Michigan. It always did. For the legions of kids who chafed through an idle morning on that day, it was the capital sin of the game department. Here we were, truant if it was a weekday, doubly mortgaged to chores if we were farm kids, and the bureaucrats would not drop the leashes till 12 a.m. For Lassie and I, no geological epoch had ever lasted longer. She sat there at the far end of the cornfield in the broken shade of a half-nude hickory, a camouflage of autumn colors, a golden bullet waiting to be fired the length of the field. I stood quietly at the other end, leaning against the cottonwood, my outline clearly visible to her. At the first shot in the distance, I slipped from behind the trunk and across the end rows to a point where corn, brush row, and a soybean field met. No wind rustled life into the drooping, frost-killed stalks. Yellow light hung in the still air, as fixed as memories, as eternal as his youth to the young. I reached up for my hat, took one deep breath, and spun it into the sky as high as I could throw it. A brown blur flashed across the end rows, and a barred tail disappeared into the brush before I could raise the gun. That soon. And then nothing, only the thud of my pulse in my ears and the quiet light suspending the day and time. Nothing, and then everything at once. 2 hens rocketed past at head height. I swung at one, realized the sex, saw a rooster following, jerked the gun back to him, and shot swinging in the wrong direction. Another rooster jumped to the side and just as quickly dropped back down. I took off a swath of corn tassels, trying to follow him back in. Something roared off behind me, and I spun around to an empty sky. And then the quiet again, and with it, the despair that comes with recognizing failure. Lassie was hammering back and forth across the rows in front of me, not coming straight on. And only later did I realize what that should have been telling me, should have known what was about to happen. He came up with all the indignation of the monarch transgressed, wide-eyed, cackling his anger. Battle pennants snapping purple and green and gold and trailing interminably behind. My gun was too heavy, too long, too far behind. He had already leveled off before the barrel caught up to him, and I pushed it ahead of his nose desperately. I must have touched the trigger, but I don't remember the report or the jolt of a recoil, only the wings locking, the bird slanting earthward in a long glide, and Lassie intersecting the trajectory of his flight at very nearly the same speed. Fine-eating bird, Dad teased. Can't find any shot in it at all. Heart shot, I responded, perhaps a bit too casually. Dad rolled his eyes, but Ma nodded approvingly. No meat was wasted that way. I have a black lab now and have done well by Grandpa in her training. She's a beautiful, tractable animal, delivers to hand with a soft mouth, and works closely for these legs and reflexes slowed by the miles of seasons. Hunting is still the best reason for getting up in the dark, and October is still the finest month of the year. But when tail begins to thrum and nose is glued to ground and the rooster comes up like thunder out of the corn. I always see spots of white and gold on my lab, and yesterday is not so very far away.